Welcome everybody back here for the lunch. It's been a terrific conference, and now we have another highlight for our luncheon address. I am thrilled that Gil Kerlikowske is with us this afternoon. He, of course, is the director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy. He has been serving now since the mid-first year of the Obama administration. And of course, he has a very distinguished background and brings tremendous experience, especially with community policing, to this position. He's responsible for coordinating all the dimensions of federal drug control policy in his position. He's been traveling extensively, both to Mexico, Latin America, in the United States. As you may know, he came to the position after serving for 9 years as the chief of police of Seattle. And his record there was amazing. When he left office, crime was at the lowest levels in the city that it had been for 40 years. So it was really an amazing performance. Prior to that, he was the Deputy Director for Community-Oriented Policing Services in the Department of Justice. So he has experience in the federal government as well. But a lot of his background is really on the ground. Prior to being police commissioner in Seattle, he had served in Buffalo and then many years in Florida. First, actually on the ground with the police in St. Petersburg, and then in 2 smaller cities in Florida as police commissioner. He's been very active in a spectrum of community activities. He has been the board of directors of an NGO called Fight Crime, Invest in Kids. And he was also twice elected president of the organization Major Cities Chiefs. So he's been respected and rewarded by his peers for many years. So it's really a pleasure to have the address from Gil Kerlikowske. Thank you.
Thank you all. Can you hear me back there all right? Well, obviously leaving Seattle when crime was at a 40-year low, my timing was perfect. It's always nice to figure out when to leave, especially as a police chief, and not have to be run out of town on rail. It just doesn't look very good. Well, I am delighted to be here, and thank you very much, Professor, for the introduction. Let me talk a little bit for a few minutes, and then I know that we're going to have some time for questions. But the issue of drug control in the Western Hemisphere is absolutely critical. Now, I think it's really worth stating up front that the substance abuse and the toll that it takes on our health, our public safety, our education, on the financial resources, not just in the United States, but in countries and regions throughout the world, is something that we can't dismiss. We have to really consider all of the different impacts, and we also have to consider all of the different tools that we have available to begin to lessen its impact. And it follows that in order to lessen the cost of drug use and its consequences that are imposed on us, that we have to reduce the amount of drugs being used by not only people in this country, but throughout the world. Secretary Clinton and others have mentioned this repeatedly when she talks both about a shared responsibility, but also about our responsibility to reduce our own demand. There was a time when the question of how to reduce drug use continued to be cast as an all or nothing choice between demand reduction and supply reduction. You were either for demand reduction or you were for supply reduction, or you would have these incredible artificial discussions about how much money was being spent on demand reduction and supply reduction, as if there was actually a black and white distinction. And what we really recognize and really realize is that that distinction really does not exist. We know today that both supply reduction and demand reduction have had major impacts on illicit drug availability and use. It was once common to imagine that either-or choice about how to deal with drug users, either through that law enforcement measures on the one hand or the so-called soft-on-drugs approach on the other. The truth is, of course, that drug control has never been all or nothing, either or, and it always has involved this combination of tools. But it's also true that experience and science has taught us a lot more, particularly over the last decade, about what we know in these effective tools to deal with the drug problem. That's why the Obama administration has been so committed to the thorough reorganization and the rebalancing of our efforts to reduce drug use and its consequences. Instead of seeing the nation's efforts against substance abuse and its consequences through the war lens or the war on drug lens, the administration is promoting a very new and comprehensive approach to drug policy that strengthens our focus on prevention, on raising awareness of addiction as a disease, enhancing the support of those in recovery from addiction, and promoting the smarter use of law enforcement resources. And at the heart of the approach is what we know about addiction, that it is a disease. It's not a moral failing. Addiction is preventable, it's treatable. Recovery from addiction is quite possible, and oftentimes, at least here in the United States, there can be some myths surrounding that. Well, our approach starts with prevention, because the most effective and efficient means of addressing a disease like addiction is to stop it before it ever starts. And years of research on prevention taught us that youth substance initiation and use and share some common risk pathways to other problem behaviors like aggression and other risky behaviors. That's why through our national anti-drug youth media campaign, we really rewrote the script, because when we talked about the dangers in the past of drug use, oftentimes to a younger generation, the dangers such as an example of extreme sports, that was often talked about as something that would be more gratifying to them rather than actually understanding the dangers. So the changes in our media campaign really reflect that. We know a lot more about prevention today than we did in the last decade. Stopping drug use before it begins is unique from other types of prevention. And there are risk factors specific to substance abuse, like missing school, hanging out with the wrong crowd, getting bad grades. All of these things have to be considered in designing and supporting effective drug prevention programs. The President's commitment to prevention is quite real. The President's fiscal year 2012 National Drug Control Budget requests federal resources totaling $1.7 billion to support a variety of education and outreach programs aimed at preventing the initiation of drug use. This represents a 7.9%, about $123 million increase over the fiscal year 2010 enacted level. We're also working with our international allies, including other consumer countries, to reduce drug consumption and the global supply of drugs. And following years of such support from the United States, there have been a host of nations that have successfully begun to nationalize their own counter-drug efforts. And as we engage in this national and international conversation about drug policy, it's essential to evaluate programs and to evaluate them quite objectively. It's very hard to argue against the proposition of what works, especially in an austere budget environment which we are all facing. The issue is an emotional one for many. We know that there are a lot of data gaps. We are implementing measures that allow us to more effectively evaluate programs because we know that every policy is not effective. By the way, when I was a police chief, every policy and program, some were less successful than others, but none of them were ever failures. But in drug policy, we actually know there are things that don't work. As we go about deciding which ones to keep and which ones to end, we have to avoid the temptation of either condemning all or hanging on to those that are in fact not effective. That's why we devoted an entire chapter of the National Drug Control Strategy that's being updated right now to be released probably within the next month. It's devoted to programs to build and strengthen drug data gathering and analysis. The emphasis on measurable performance metrics extends throughout the budget. The Obama administration clearly believes the National Drug Control Budget should represent the full range of federal spending, including cost costs associated with the consequences of drug use, and that's why we revised our calculations. That was also with the insistence of members of Congress who felt that the changes in looking at the National Drug Control budget in the past left out some very important components. This empirical data provides this reasonable basis for a consistent estimation of drug control-related funding and to quantify the different agencies' involvement in their drug control activities. Before being admitted into that unique circle of drug control strategies, budgets, there had to be a sound methodology of actually how they could be included and how they could be counted. We always work to improve the quality and quantity of the information so that we can shed light on the effectiveness of our efforts. And we have provided effective assistance in Colombia, for instance, and it has borne a lot of fruit under Plan Colombia to reduce violence and insecurity, cut the production potential for cocaine substantially. Between the peak in 2001 and last year, cocaine production potential in Colombia fell about 700 metric tons pure to about 270 metric tons pure in 2009. Importantly, the supply reduction success in Colombia has not produced that balloon effect that some predicted, whereby progress in one region would be offset by losses in an adjacent region. While there have been some increases in Peruvian coca production for the entire Andean region, potential production for pure cocaine has fallen by about 1/3 since 2001. In a related fact, and not remarked upon enough, we are now entering the 4th year of a major disruption in cocaine availability on the streets of the United States. Not only has demand fallen, as shown by surveys as well as measures in the workplace and arrestee drug testing, but domestic price per pure gram for cocaine has risen steeply and the purity has dropped significantly. The reality is that there has been progress and even major achievements accomplished in the United States drug policy in areas of drug consumption, drug production, drug criminal activity, and the harmful effects of impact of drugs themselves. We don't believe that legalization is an answer. That was just stated as recently as 3 weeks ago by President Obama in a YouTube discussion. Many, including former presidents of Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia, believe that efforts to control drugs by making them illegal are futile and suggest that decriminalization or legalization approaches would be superior. I hear this discussion and I'm struck by the fact that the former leaders have not recognized the changes in U.S. drug policy. They still talk about it as a war on drugs, and yet so much has actually changed in these last few years, ignoring some of the things that we already know about drug control generally. Where we can agree with even those who advocate for that different approach is that this is not a problem for law enforcement alone. Guiding a drug addict into effective evidence-based treatment program is less costly and far more effective than incarcerating them and then releasing them without ever dealing with the underlying problem of addiction. Prevention, treatment, and public health responses to illicit drug use are hallmarks of the Obama administration's drug control strategy, and it's reinforced by those major budgetary investments for the programs such as the ones I just mentioned. But decriminalizing or legalizing dangerous drugs would be a profound mistake, leading to more use and more harmful consequences. The laws against drugs make a difference. Well, the data show that most prevalent illegal drug, marijuana, in our country has a rate of current use in the United States population that is substantially lower than rates found for other but legal substances. For instance, alcohol, almost 8 times higher, cigarettes, legal, almost 3 times higher. It is clear that the risks and the disincentives against using illegal marijuana are factors in maintaining lower prevalence. Our efforts to reduce demand for marijuana have proven effective over time. From 2001 to 2006, youth use of marijuana, as measured by the School-Based Monitoring the Future survey, fell fully 24%. Granted, in the last 2 years, as it flattened, and then in last year, there was an increase in drug use among youth use, and I'm happy to discuss that also. Seen in a longer historical perspective, youth drug use has fallen since the late 1970s. National surveys show that in 1979, 14.2% of youth 12 to 17 reported current use of marijuana. By 2009, that figure had fallen to 7.3%. A similar story of major progress on the demand side can be seen for the use of cocaine, current use of which stood at 2.6% of the population, 12 and older in 1979, and in 2009, that number dropped to only 0.7%. More recent data also show a sharp decline in cocaine use since 2007. In that year, there were an estimated 2.1 million past month users of cocaine in the United States. By 2009, the number had declined 21% to an estimated 1.6 million users. It's also worth mentioning that Portugal, which is sometimes held up as a model for others, does not argue that its approach is right for other countries. And when I visited Portugal, the experts I spoke with were very clear in stating their approach is tailored to their country's unique history, culture, demographics, and it is not a plug-and-play policy for any other country. In the United States, we begin with the premise that demand for drugs can actually be reduced. We want to utilize the proven power of prevention and treatment. We're committed to leveraging the innovative criminal justice programs. For instance, we're strong supporters of drug courts, a proven means of using the criminal justice system to get people in need of treatment into, in fact, treatment. We also embrace other new innovative approaches, the Drug Market Initiative, or DMI, also probation testing and sanctions modeled after Project Hope. These programs utilize regular drug testing regimens combined with swift and sure but moderate sanctions. A decade ago, it was common for countries to be characterized also as either drug producers, drug transit, or drug consumer nations. But these neat distinctions no longer are so clear. Today, the United States produces large amounts of potent marijuana, both on the public lands and within grow houses as a result of foreclosures, etc. Both prosperous but also impoverished countries in this hemisphere are struggling with increasing rates of addiction. The threat to national security in Colombia has been diminished, but it has been no means eliminated. As criminal gangs emerge with power and financing to threaten public safety, in particular regions, terrorist organizations still refuse to lay down their arms. Mexico today, with our full support, is fighting to root out the violence, the corruption, and the power of the criminal gangs in their midst. And we have already delivered the bulk of military and other equipment required by Mexico, and our focus is to steadily be moving to assist them with training and institutional enhancement. We must focus our approach throughout the hemisphere on measures that contribute to sustainable hemispheric solutions. There is nothing more important in this regard than creating conditions where our assistance is no longer needed. We're evolving from a nation that provides equipment and short-term assistance to one that builds capacity in these countries to provide for themselves. President Obama's upcoming visit to Brazil, Chile, and El Salvador underscores our concern for the Americas and that amidst competing global priorities and challenges, the Americas remain a vital strategic partner to the United States. There's a large role for AID in the hemisphere, from strengthening Congresses, municipalities in helping ministries of health, guarantee high-quality, affordable care, ministries of education that ensure that children are being prepared for 21st century jobs. And in Peru, for example, the United States is providing direct assistance to the National Counter-Drug Agency and municipal governments to develop economic alternatives for former COVID growers. And of course, in countries in immediate crisis, the lack of security can make it difficult or impossible for institutional construction necessary for sustainable drug-free communities in other nations. Crime discourages community development and private investment, and it diverts public and private resources that could otherwise be used for more productive investments. The Obama administration is deepening President Bush's constructive Merida initiative to combat crime in Mexico and Central America and expanding that effort into the Caribbean. These initiatives will strengthen the capacity of judicial systems to fairly and effectively provide justice, and it will increase the amount of help we provide to prevent people from using drugs and to treat those that are already addicted. The heart of what AID will be doing involves supporting preventive anti-crime measures, providing vulnerable youth to lure them away from crime, and about positive and productive alternatives. And that means creating safe urban spaces, providing job training, and engaging in concerted efforts to keep youth in school. In Colombia, with security in place, AID has helped to reduce coca production by as much as 85% in those geographic areas where we collaborated with the government and local communities. And today, thousands of farmers in Colombia who once cultivated coca are now growing completely legal crops. So we have a policy that's more hemispheric in scope than we have had in the past. The measures we use extend beyond drug production potential and flow toward the United States. We're focused now on sustainability and proceed from the perspective that the entire hemisphere is challenged by crime, drug abuse, and inadequate levels of treatment. We seek cooperation with nations and international organizations. On the intellectual side of the equation, we are consulting broadly on our policy with academics, with NGOs, and as well within our own government. Breaking down those silos was particularly important. The impact of the United States drug control policy can be seen literally in millions of citizens who today are in recovery from substance abuse, those for whom treatment and recovery services literally transformed their lives. Thank you very much, and I am happy to take questions. Yes. Yes, please.
My name is Michelle with Global Vision Venezuela. I'm Gil Kerlikowske. You didn't mention toxic countries like Venezuela, and I wonder if you can comment on that and what is the situation right now. Thank you.
I just returned from Colombia just several weeks ago, and certainly the transit issues of cocaine going into Venezuela are of concern, but I was also very much assured that leaders and members of the government of Venezuela were very intent on reducing this, that being labeled as a transit country was not one that was something that they aspired to. I think the other part that's very fascinating right now is the regionality and the leadership, particularly when the summit will be held this summer, and whether or not at what point the discussion revolves around not only drug production, also around drug transit, but then more importantly, what are the causes of increased addiction in some of these countries. Actually, I don't know of any country that has been immune from that increased addiction, as the traffickers in fact pay their employees in product rather than some other for currency, for example. Yes, other questions, please. Yes.
President Calderon will be in Washington this week, and one of the issues that people say may dominate the bilateral talks is security. And in that sense, there is, this sense in Mexico that the U.S. is not doing enough to, explain the fact that there are criminal cartels in Mexico. And at the same time, there is a sense among U.S. officials that Mexico is not doing, enough in size to have a more effective fight in this organization. So the question is, what can both countries do in order to have a better understanding about the, what responsibility has each one in order to have a more effective fight in these criminal organizations?
I think what might be helpful too is to take just a bit of a step back in time. It wasn't that many years ago that we would point our fingers to Mexico and say, keep those drugs out of the hands of our wonderful youth and keep those drugs out of our country, and you should be doing more. And in turn, officials in Mexico, people in Mexico, would point their finger to the United States and say, look, if you weren't consuming so much in drug use, we wouldn't have many of the critical problems that are facing us. I never hear that conversation today. I do hear that we should be doing more to reduce demand, but as I mentioned, whether it was Secretary Clinton or others, we've clearly recognized that reducing our own demand is not only helpful to the United States, but also helpful to the people of Mexico. But I've also heard very clearly that the United States should be doing more to stem the flow of bulk cash that goes back to feed the organizations, that we should also be doing more to stem the flow of arms from the United States going back into Mexico. And I know significant progress has been made in both of those areas. I clearly recognize that more must be done, more needs to be done, but I would also tell you from my previous life and previous background that I have never seen greater trust, greater cooperation, greater levels of information sharing among law enforcement authorities between the United States and Mexico than I've seen in the last 2 years, all of which has led to plaza bosses and cartel leaders who now have a considerably shortened shelf life. Granted, people will say, well, then someone else will immediately take their place. But I think the researchers will tell you clearly that disrupting drug trafficking does have some positive benefits. Eliminating those cartels. The other part I'd mention about the cartels is that they are clearly, we always talk about drug cartels, drug trafficking organizations, but with their heavy involvement in stealing from Pemex, auto parts, kidnapping, extortion, arson, on, drug trafficking is only one part of the drug cartel's funding base. So I think for the people of Mexico, President Calderon, to take this on with the courageousness that he and his administration and people have shown speaks very loudly about our need to support him in every way possible. Yes?
Phil McLean from CSIS. Sir, you've given a very nuanced answer to a very complicated question of drugs. But in fact, the issue tends to get made in very rhetorical terms, one way or the other. Looking at your website, I don't find there the type of information that the public could use very, very readily to back up the type of things that you're saying. I think there is a sense that we're headed towards legalization, and I just came, like you did, just came back from Colombia, and that is very discouraging to people like President Santos. Just as they're getting on board, we're going the other direction.
I think the issue around the legalization debate, and particularly our involvement with what went on in California with Proposition 19. So the president, when he was running for office as a candidate, stated his opposition to legalizing drugs. He stated it, I think now no less than 3 times when it has been brought up as a question to him. But I think in particular, when you look at California, the information that we provided and were of some assistance to the people of California was more important, particularly right now in the climate that we face here in the United States, was more important than us parachuting into California, telling Californians what they needed to do. My sense is that the history of medical marijuana going back to 1996 was that various administrations, different parties, would go to those states, my predecessors, tell people that this would not be a good idea to vote for medical marijuana, etc., and people turned around and did that anyhow. I think it tells you that perhaps we're more important giving substance and voice and information to the people that are closest to those voters in those particular states that are addressing this. And I think the president has been clear. I think we could probably do a better job on our website than we do, but that's a good consideration. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Eric Olson from the Woodrow Wilson Center. How are you?
Hey,
Thank you. You know, a centerpiece of U.S. drug policy in this country over the last 2 decades has been incarceration. And we certainly saw that a lot, I'm sure, in Seattle. Policy has been, you know, put people in jail to the point that we have really now one of the highest incarceration populations in the world, except for maybe China. If you're not going to talk about decriminalization or legalization, does it mean that we're going to continue this policy? Has that policy really been effective in reducing demand in this country? What are the sorts of cost-benefit analysis of that? Because it's extremely expensive.
Incarceration is incredibly expensive. Treatment is about half the cost. But I would think over the last several years that's changed pretty radically, particularly for arrest or incarceration for small amounts of drugs and somewhat, of course, around marijuana. There is now a governor, and I just finished meeting with the National Governors Conference that has been here the last several days. There's not a governor that I spoke with, regardless of party, who is not looking at reducing their criminal justice costs. And right now, Kentucky is drastically changing, or is in the process of drastically changing their laws, particularly around low-level drug offenders. Governor Kasich in Ohio, brand new governor, has announced similar ideas. And the people that have already been on board for some time were my colleagues. They never talked about a war on drugs. They often said you can't arrest your way out of this problem. And of course, I think that's true in other places right now. President Medvedev has recently said there is no police solution to our drug problem in Russia. So I would tell you that it could be a factor of changing people's heart and minds, or it could be a factor of their running out of money. I don't think I'd attribute it to one in particular. But when the president asked me if we could make progress on this, not just this in particular, but on drug policy, I said 2 years ago, the wind's at our backs, the terrible economy is causing people to really rethink the way we deal with the drug problem here in the United States, but also in other places around the globe. Yes, sir, way in the back.
Sure. Winston Wilkinson from a neighboring academic institution. Question about the upcoming President Obama's upcoming trip to Latin America. Do you envision that drug policy might be on the table, at least in the discussions when he meets with President Dilma in Brazil?
Well, there will be no doubt that I'm sure when President Calderon visits, I believe Thursday this week, I'm sure the discussion around the President's trip to Latin America, there could very well be some discussion around drug policy in particular. El Salvador and Brazil would be important. But I think the details of any of that discussion, either pre or post, would be best addressed to the White House. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for the talk. My name is Alex Fraser. I'm a graduate student here at the Elliott School. And my question is about President Calderon's comments last week about coordination and lack thereof between U.S. agencies in Mexico, specifically related to the killing of the ICE agent. And I'm curious what you would like to see done to help improve coordination, or what you are going to see done in the future.
Well, there's been an awful lot of discussion that if only you can take the template of Colombia and transfer it to Mexico. As we all know in this room, Mexico is not Colombia. You don't transfer Portugal to the United States, and you don't transfer the template of Colombia to Mexico. So I think there is, and I've attended some of the law enforcement training at Iztapalapa. I've met with a number of law enforcement officials. The quality of the hiring, the enthusiasm of new personnel, the quality of the training, also, by the way, with a focus on human rights and protections, was very impressive to me. Do I think more could be done for better coordination between the two countries or within organizations? I don't think I'd end up pointing my finger too much at the government of Mexico. Having spent a lot of time in police departments where we didn't talk to the sheriff next door, I'm not so sure I would criticize a country of that size with those many large law enforcement institutions, all of which, by the way, are undergoing pretty significant change right now, and including moving to the advocacy or adversarial system of justice. Pretty tough issues to take on all at once. Any other questions? Yes?
I'm Jose Diaz, the Reforma newspaper from
I
Mexico.
know that.
The question here, please allow me to mention it to you, and I hope you don't feel offended with it, but
I've never been offended by you.
I wanted to ask you about the relevance of your office itself. President Obama diminished the category of the office by putting it out of the cabinet, and most recently the Republican members of the House, in this discussion about budgets and so on in the continuing resolution that was discussed so much, they cut down, well, they were proposing to cut down a significant amount of resources for your office specifically. And the question is, why this drug czar's relevance is not as high as people in the Western Hemisphere, other Western Hemisphere countries would like to see it? What's happening among society in the U.S. that doesn't see the drug problem in such a relevance, that is affecting other countries? Why is not in the public debate that much?
I think there are a couple things. One is every president chooses the offices that are in or outside of the cabinet. When this office was first established, Bill Bennett was the first drug czar, and he was not a member of the cabinet. And he said, and when I met with him, he said, look, the most important thing that you need to have, regardless of if you're in the cabinet, is that you have the ear and the access to the people within the administration. Now, Bill Bennett had been the Secretary of Education, and he remarked, he said, I was in the cabinet as the Secretary of Education. He said, it's not that big a deal. And so I've been very pleased and very happy with the access to the meetings I've had with administration officials, including the Vice President, who was instrumental in creating this. And I couldn't have a better supporter of ONDCP than to have the person whose fingerprints were on just about every criminal justice policy, including ONDCP, when Vice President Biden was then chairman of the Judiciary Committee. So I don't think it's a question of us not paying as much attention to drugs. I think it's a fact that we have to recognize that the drug problem, and I mentioned this to the President, if I look at our relationship with Mexico, Colombia, Afghanistan, on and on, I look at the southwest border, I look at race relations, I look at keeping kids in school, having a better graduation rate, having a better prepared workforce, and if I look at healthcare costs, the drug issue is part and parcel, or a very important part of every single one of those issues. But it isn't always the preeminent part. It isn't always the first thing you think of. Race relations, and drug arrests, or high school graduation, marijuana use. But it plays into all of that. So I would tell you that I'm quite satisfied with the support. I think we are in the second part at very difficult budget times. I looked at everything from the COPS program, community-oriented policing, to our program, to many others that were all receiving recommendations of significant cuts. And I think that's just reflective of the tough budget times. What actually will occur, not sure I can predict that. Maybe one more question? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Amanda Delgado, a student here at the Elliott School. Thank you for speaking with us. This morning, Ambassador Sarukan characterized the endgame in fighting organized crime in Mexico as seeing a reduction in violent deaths in Mexico, as well as increasing the opportunity cost for drug trafficking organizations. And I was curious to hear from you what you would characterize as the endgame in fighting the drug traffic from Mexico.
I think clearly, Arturo has been a very good friend. He has been a very good mentor for me on this issue. And I know that the goal of making civil society stronger, of reducing the number of deaths that occurs in Mexico. It's important in some ways to also recognize that because Mexico is our neighbor and because we have so much media attention, that there are other countries, certainly in Central and South America, with very high violent crime levels that don't get the same amount of attention in the American media that in fact Mexico does. But that goal of reducing violence is actually critical. The other goal that I would see as a marked measure of success would be to move away from the military doing policing and to have civilian policing that not only is able to handle the job, but civilian policing that is seen as trusted, professional, and competent. And quite frankly, that is still a work in progress within Mexico. Thank you.